everybody to today's webinar presentation by Professor Kumar Ramakrishna. This is part of the CTPSR webinar series, and for those of you who weren't able to make last week's presentation by Professor Jinggan Zhen, who reflected on the most recent Communist Party conference in China, the recording of that will be up in the next week or so, and I recommend that you seek that one out. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Adam Fenton, who is going to introduce Professor Ramakrishna.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. It's actually a great honor for me to introduce Professor Ramakrishna this morning. I did my PhD research on terrorism in Indonesia and Indonesia's anti-terrorism laws. And Professor Ramakrishna was certainly one of the scholars that I cited in my PhD thesis. So this is a great honor. It was an honor to meet you, Professor Ramakrishna, a couple of months ago when you were here in Coventry, and meet you in person. And it's great to have you back again today for today's webinar. So I'll just introduce you. So Kumar Ramakrishna is a professor of National Security Studies, Provost's Chair in National Security Studies, Associate Dean in charge of Policy Studies, as well as Head of the International Centre for Political Violence and Terrorism Research in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, NTU. A historian by background, Professor Ramakrishna has been a frequent speaker on counterterrorism before local and international audiences, a regular media commentator on counterterrorism, and an established author in numerous internationally refereed journals. His first book, Emergency Propaganda, The Winning of Malayan Hearts and Minds, 1948 to 1958, published in 2002, was described by the International History Review as required reading for historians of Malaya, and for those whose task is to counter insurgents, guerrillas, and terrorists. His second major book, Radical Pathways, Understanding Muslim Radicalization in Indonesia, was featured as one of the top 150 books on terrorism and counterterrorism in the respected journal Perspectives on Terrorism, which identified Professor Ramakrishna as one of Southeast Asia's leading counterterrorism experts. His recent research has focused on understanding, preventing, and countering violent extremism in Southeast Asia. His latest book is Extremist Islam, Recognition and Response in Southeast Asia, published earlier this year, and here is a copy of it. And this is the book, the topic that we will be discussing today, Extremist Islam in Southeast Asia. So with that, I would like to welcome Professor Ramakrishna and hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam, for the very kind introduction, and it's very good to be here. Well, it's evening here in Singapore, it's morning in the UK. Glad to be able to share with all of you some of the elements of the book which Adam mentioned, which I was able to publish this year. It's called Extremist Islam, Recognition in Response in Southeast Asia. So that's the book which was published by OUP earlier this year. So this presentation essentially draws upon the book. So we look at Southeast Asia, right? What can we say about the evolving threat? Well, certainly evolved in the past 2 decades since 9/11, and in particular, the discovery of the Jamaah Islamiyah at that time was a pretty much Al-Qaeda linked network, transnational terrorist network, JI in Southeast Asia. It's evolved, right? Back then, the threat which people were concerned about was from organized terrorist networks like Al-Qaeda and Jamaah Islamiyah in our region, Southeast Asia, that, as I mentioned, were at the outset quite hierarchically organized. However, the situation, the threat picture has evolved, as many of us know, since the mid-2010s. While there are still organized network threats like ISIS since mid-2014, right? And within Indonesia, pro-ISIS groups like Jamaah Ansarud Daulah, JAD, the East Indonesian Mujahideen or MIT, even Southern Philippines, for example, the well-known Abu Sayyaf group. Thanks to internet and social media, the extremist ideology which pervades such groups has evolved and spread through cyberspace. So this has given rise to the self-radicalization and lone wolf threat as well. In fact, I think about middle of this year, the Singapore Ministry of Home Affairs, in their annual threat assessment, they mentioned that the pro-ISIS ecosystem on social media is a concern for, well, the region. So this talk will examine the evolving online transnational Islamist terror threat in Southeast Asia, but also other elements of what I call the Salafabist ecosystem in the region. The ecosystem involves, well, social media platforms, but it's more than that, as I shall explain. So maybe just a quick sketch of the current threat situation in Southeast Asia from last year until, I would say, about this year as well. Actually, the situation has been improving security-wise due to continuation of enhanced counterterrorism operations in key countries. In particular, leadership decapitation operations and retaking of terrorist safe havens have occurred, particularly in Mindanao and Southern Philippines, which have reduced the operational capacity of some of the threat groups in Mindanao. However, terrorist plots and attacks continue. They've been reported in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. Of course, the pandemic restrictions did impact not just general public, but also restricted the space and opportunity for the militants themselves to meet and move freely inter or intrastate. And of course, because of the pandemic restrictions, this reduced the opportunities for big crowds in public places to mass, and therefore become potential target for mass casualty attacks by the threat groups. Of course, the militants didn't stand still. They tried to respond to the restrictions in various ways. For example, the calls for lone wolf attacks grew during the pandemic, particularly in Indonesia. But what we have also seen, which was actually a pre-pandemic trend, was a greater involvement of women, youth, and family networks in operational roles, actually including as suicide bombers. And of course, as what happened during the pandemic around the world, we also saw that in Southeast Asia. You know, people who were stuck at home because of lockdowns, right? They ended up spending more time online. And this raised the possibility of particularly vulnerable and impressionable individuals being exposed to extremist ideologies. So, which brings me to the topic of this particular talk, the Salafabist threat to Southeast Asia. So what is Salafabism, right? I mean, it's tied to a bigger question. I mean, the general question of, you know, what do we mean really when we talk about Islamist extremist ideology anyway? I mean, we all know, those of us who study the field know that there are different terminologies that have been used to explain what is meant by Islamist extremism, right? Radical Islam, radical Islamism, Wahhabism, well, jihadi Islamism, jihadi Salafism, right? Salafi jihadism is very common, even Salafism per se, right? But Salafi is, I would say Salafi is too broad and sensitive a term, because, like, I mean, when you talk about Salafi, what kind of Salafi are you talking about? I mean, there are the modernist Salafis, and then there are the purist Salafis. Sorry, it's a bit of a thunderstorm outside. So my argument is that what we should be concerned about more precisely is what I would call Salafabist extremism. So I didn't invent the term Salafabism. It was actually a term popularized by scholars like Khalid Abu al-Fadil of UCLA, the late Australian scholar Riaz Hassan, and the German scholar Philip Holtman, right? In a nutshell, Salafabist extremism is essentially Wahhabized purist Salafism. We can talk about this more if you are interested. Well, this is one attempt to explain Salafabism. So the consistent characteristic of Salafabism is a supremacist Puritanism that compensates for feelings of defeatism, disempowerment, and alienation, right? With a distinct sense of self-righteous arrogance in comparison to the nondescript other, whether the other is the West, non-believers in general, or even Muslim women. So according to this model, there are only two paths in life: the path of God, the straight path, and the path of Satan, the crooked path. So according to the Salafabists, Islam is the only straight path in life and must be pursued regardless of what others think and how it impacts on their rights and well-being. So this is a definition and explanation of Salafabism by the well-known scholar Khalid Abu al-Fadil, who has actually written about this at some length, right? So basically, the Salafabist model, Salafabist mindset is a very us and them, black and white, good versus evil, binary, rigid binary mindset, which has all these elements of supremacism, you know, and a sense of righteous, self-righteous arrogance towards, you know, those on the out-group side, right? So in the book, I talk about two modes of Salafabist extremism, right? One, which is something which most of us are very familiar with, and in fact, most practitioners will be focusing on. This would be the violent people, the violent guys, right? The violent, hard, what I call the hard Salafabist, Salafi jihadis. And this would be, well, ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Southeast Asia, JAI, Jamaat Ansarud Daulah, for example. This is most obvious. These are the truly violent Salafabist, Salafi jihadis. But I also, in the book, try to point out the potential challenge posed by what I would call not violent, soft Salafabist Islamists, right? Which are, to me, also a potential concern. So you note that I use the term not violent rather than non-violent. So there's a reason for it. And in the book, I talk about how different scholars have tried to bring out the point that, you know, as Alex Schmidt from the University of Vienna puts it, some ideas carry within them the seeds of at best intolerance and adverse violence. So these so-called non-violent extremists have been found to be, and this is the point, ideologically closer to jihadi organizations than the peaceful Muslim mainstream majority. So Schmidt is saying that some type of Islamists are actually very ideologically similar to the violent Salafi jihadis. So this is why I don't personally think there is such a thing as a term non-violent extremist. Other scholars like, for example, Jacob Olidot argues, and this is a key point, because of a shared theological DNA, right, the move from quietists to the jihadists does not require a significant change in ideology. In other words, the move from a soft Salafabist Islamist to a hard Salafabist Salafi jihadi does not take too much effort because of the shared theological DNA. Another scholar, Thomas Heckhammer, makes a similar point. He says that there are sociological and discursive links between the militant Islamists and non-violent actors sharing the same dominant rationale. Same point, right, expressed differently. So the point is, soft Salafabist Islamists have a shared theological DNA with the hard Salafabist Salafi jihadis. Both groups are extremists. They are Salafabist extremists, just operating in different modes. One group is not violent, right? The other group is violent, right? So, and there are porous boundaries between them, which is why I would say that, you know, soft Salafabist Islamists are more accurately understood as not violent rather than genuinely non-violent. So therefore, soft Salafabist Islamists are arguably of policy concern too. We also, and in the book, I also talk about the need to distinguish the Salafabist radicals from the Salafabist extremists, right? A radical is not an extremist. A radical is relatively open-minded, and you can debate and negotiate with a radical. An extremist, on the other hand, is closed-minded and impervious to alternative viewpoints. So my argument is that hard law enforcement measures should be used to deal with the Salafabist extremists, both, as I mentioned, both the soft Salafabist Islamists and the hard Salafabist Salafi jihadis, because they have a shared theological DNA, and the borders between the two categories are quite, I mean, the borders are quite porous, right? But these are the extremists, right? Whether they are soft Salafabist Islamists or the hard Salafabist Salafi jihadis, these are extremists, but they're also radicals. And radicals should be treated differently, in my view. So both governments and civil societies should be able to identify, accommodate, and work with the Salafabist radicals. Those individuals and groups that may have relatively system transformative ideas, but unlike the extremists, the radicals are willing to work peacefully within secular, multicultural political systems, constitutionally, peacefully, and they are genuine about it. I mean, they are actually genuine about it. So therefore, the policy challenge is to differentiate, right, the Salafabist extremists from the radicals. And indeed, of course, the wider community of moderate Muslims within Islamist political parties and civil society spaces in Southeast Asia. So of course, the question then arises, okay, then how do we identify the Salafabist extremists from the Salafabist radical? So in the book, I actually try to engage with this question, and I try to make it a broader issue. So I don't just look at the Salafabist or the Islamists, right? I look at the all religious extremists in general. So how do we identify religious extremists in general, right, from the religious radicals? So in the book, I talk about 7 key characteristics of religious extremists, generally speaking, right? First, the religious extremist, whether he's a Salafabist or a Buddhist or a Hindu or Christian extremist, right? And that's my argument, right? The first characteristic of a religious extremist is he displays an intense emotional fanatical attachment to his sectarian religious belief system, elevating it above recognized international customs, as well as national, constitutional, ideological, and theological currents. In other words, the first characteristic is this sense of identity supremacy. His group, his in-group, his religious in-group must be on top, right? Must be on top of the pecking order in society, above everybody else, right? Well, regardless of what the Constitution says. Second, the religious extremist is dogmatically committed to the notion that his in-group is inherently morally superior to relevant out-groups. So there's this strong sense of in-group bias. I mean, some scholars talk about how the in-group has a good essence, right, compared to the out-group. So you have this in-group bias. And third, concomitantly, the extremist is committed to the notion that while the in-group has a good essence, the out-group has an inherent bad essence, right? So you have in-group bias going hand in glove with out-group prejudice, right? So you have the first 3 characteristics of the religious extremism. Number 1, the sense of in-group identity supremacy. Number 2, the in-group, no matter what, is morally superior to the out-group. And number 3, no matter what, the out-group is morally inferior and is just, full of bad essence, right? So these very simplistic thinking, right? Fourth, there is a strong fixation and even obsession with purity of the in-group and fear of contamination of the good essence of the in-group through commingling or mixing around with the out-group. So this is manifested, for example, in calls by the extremists for social segregationism. Come out and be separate from them, right? Discrimination, social, economic discrimination, certainly no intermarriage, no patronizing of their businesses, etc. Fifth characteristic is a certain, in their pronouncements, online or offline, there's a clearly what some scholars call low integrity complexity. So essentially this means that there's these guys, they have a very pronounced dualistic black and white, simple thinking, resulting in a very simplified view of the world, right? There is no gray. It's everything black and white. It's 0 or 1, right? 6, there is a tendency to engage in, I think it's quite significant for religious extremists, what Susan Benesch calls dangerous speech towards outgroup members, including speech content that dehumanizes the outgroup, for example, as vermin, pests, insects, or animals, right? So what I have added into the original work by Benesch is I came up with this concept of, 2 types of dangerous speech. Dangerous speech in the hard mode, which is where you have the religious extremists directly inciting outgroup violence, saying go out and kill them very clearly and overtly. And the more subtle, harder to detect soft mode, where there may not be any direct incitement to violence, although linguistic dehumanization may be employed. I mean, we call these members of the outgroup, like vermin, pests, insects, or animals, but there is no direct incitement to the in-group members to go out and kill and murder members of the outgroup. So this is soft mode. So hard mode and soft mode in dangerous speech exist, but both are, to me, equally problematic. And the 7th key characteristic of the religious extremists generally is the religious extremist very actively seeks, by any means possible, including, if possible, potentially violence, the political power to restructure the wider polity and society to reflect his preferred vision of a religiously legitimated socio-political order that marginalizes relevant outgroups. So it's what the religious extremist looks religious, but it's all about power. It's about political power, trying to capture the power to impose his particular vision on everybody else, right, in the society. So in the book, I also unpack the phenomenon of religious extremism further. And I argue that the 7 key characteristics of religious extremists I've just highlighted, religious extremists in general, and Salafabist extremists in particular, since the book is about Salafabist extremism in Southeast Asia, are 2 further points to note. Religious extremism is, to me, an acute form of religious fundamentalism, number 1, and number 2, we must understand that violence is not just physical harm. It can be more indirect, built into the system. It can be structural, right? So let me unpack those 2 points. Religious, some scholars say that, all the religious rhetoric of some of these groups, right, is just a rhetorical device to mask more basic and more ostensibly more important socioeconomic or material grievances, right? So I don't agree with that. I argue that the religiosity expressed by these extremist groups is real and substantive. It's not just a rhetorical device, right? So that's why I argue that religious extremism is an acute form of fundamentalism. So fundamentalism, there have been much scholarship on it, right? The well-known fundamentalism project of the University of Chicago defined fundamentalism as embattled forms of spirituality, right? So this is a very authoritative understanding of fundamentalism, in which fundamentalist believers feel under siege from both secular modernity and competing faith groups. So as Sarah Savage puts it quite well, very pithily, right? Religious fundamentalism is essentially religion under threat, religious groups that feel under threat from secular modernity or supposedly more successful religious outgroups. This is why I argue that religious extremism can be understood as a fundamentalist belief system that legitimizes structural violence against relevant outgroups, right? And in the Southeast Asian context and in the Salafabist context, Salafabist extremism is a fundamentalist belief system that legitimizes structural violence against non-Muslims and those seen as apostates. So what is this structural violence? A couple of years ago, 2018, G.M. Berger talked about how extremist hostile action against outgroups, apart from physical violence, includes more than just physical harm. It includes verbal attacks and diminishment to discriminatory behavior. This is not a very new idea, actually. Back in 1969, Johan Galtung, in a seminal article, talked about structural violence, where, to sum up, he explains that there is such thing as violence that works on the body, physical harm, as well as violence that works on the soul, right? Where the latter would include lies, brainwashing, indoctrination of various kinds, threats that ultimately serve to decrease mental potentialities. In other words, the violence built into the structure of the society also harms the particular minority groups, for example, beyond just physical harm. It diminishes their life chances and potentialities and their potential, right? So Galtung argues that violence, more than just physical harm, can be built into the structure and shows up, for example, as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. So what's the point? The point is extremism does not always, as I mentioned, manifest in physical harm. It can be more structural, built into the system and indirect. So this idea of structural violence and the physical harm implicit and the physical and other types of harm implicit in it is well captured, in my view, in the US Anti-Defamation League's Pyramid of Hate. And this is, to me, a very good example of how extremism doesn't have to be just violent extremism. It can be not violent extremism as well. So if you look at this Pyramid of Hate, first 3 layers, right? Bias attitudes, acts of bias, discrimination. This would be not violent extremism, right? Not violent in the sense that there's no physical harm imposed upon the outgroup, but it's just as harmful, whether you're talking about at a level of bias attitude, stereotyping, insensitive remarks, to acts of bias, social avoidance, dehumanization, to discrimination, whether it's economic discrimination, political discrimination. Ultimately, this not violent extremism creates a climate of intolerance towards members of outgroups, which eventually and ultimately, as this pyramid suggests, could lead to bias-motivated violence and even ultimately genocide, right? So this is why not violent extremism extremism has a not violent element and a violent element integral to it as well. This is an idea which is captured in, many other scholars' works. For example, Hamid Abdel Samad, who is a German Egyptian political scientist, in a book he wrote a few years ago. This is, I'm just quote what he said, and I think he has a lot of insight. What he said, for example, he says in his book, to utter a word like kafir, right, infidel, is to embark on the first step to violence, treating those with different beliefs or ideas like animals and paving the road to acts of terrorism and murder. And preachers may not openly endorse violence. So this is a dangerous speech in the soft mode, right? Preachers may not openly endorse violence, but their social views and treatment of others legitimize strengthening the spiritual framework behind Islamist terrorism. So, and he's quite strong, I mean, in his views. He says that no one who lets, for example, Salafabist extremists preach anti-democratic, anti-human sermons of hate in public has a right to be surprised, and sooner or later their messages lead to violence, right? So if you look at Southeast Asia, this kind of, this approach, this perspective resonates, right? I'll just give you a couple of examples. This gentleman, Abu Bakr Bashir, he's quite a well-known Salafabist extremist in Southeast Asia, right? He was the spiritual leader of the Jamaah Islamiyah terror network in South Asia, which was Al-Qaeda linked. So if you look at, he was a religious leader. So you can see both the not violent and the violent elements of his extremism expressed in his speeches. So in public, right, you could argue that Bashir in his public sermons which at least were open to the, different people, outsiders, he would say certain things which are, not friendly. For example, in one of his sermons, he says that God has divided humanity into two parts, namely the followers of God and those who follow Satan. God's group are those prepared to follow his law, struggle for implementation, right? Meanwhile, what is meant by the other group are those that oppose God's law, right? We would rather die than follow that which you worship. So you can see it's very us and them, right? It's very us and them, very black and white. We reject all of your beliefs, reject all of your ideologies. There's no gray area, right? It's 0 or 1, right? Between you and us, will forever be a Raman or hate, and we'll be enemies and follow God's law, right? So you see, this is an example to me of not violent extremism. Nowhere here, right, did he mention that go out and kill anybody, right? But it certainly creates this sort of speech creates a climate of intolerance, right? Nobody's going to go out and make friends with the members of the out group after listening to this. So what was very interesting about people like Bashir, right, was that a journalist asked him about, why do you, in your public messages, you are so hardcore, uncompromising, right? You're not very friendly in your rhetoric. And essentially this is what he said, I'm only a craftsman selling knives, not responsible for how those knives are used, right? So that was pretty telling, at least to me, right? And of course, no surprise, at least to me then, when in private, right, for example, this meeting which Australian journalists managed to attend, right, Bashir addressed a crowd of in-group members, and perhaps the sense he had was that nobody's really looking or listening. He revealed his true sentiments, right? He likened non-Muslim tourists in Bali as worms, snakes, and maggots. Those are animals that crawl. That's pretty dehumanizing. He also cascaded the immorality of the Australian infidels. And this is where the incitement came in. He called upon the young Javanese, you beat up foreigners, don't tolerate them. He declared that Muslim Indonesia should reject the laws of the nation's parliament. That's sedition, that's pretty seditious. And following state laws that contradicted Sharia was an act of blasphemy, and encouraged his listeners, don't be scared if you're called a hardliner Muslim, as it must be like that. So what's the point? The point is, the Salafabist extremist is an extremist. who can toggle between both not violent and violent speech, essentially depending on his assessment of the evolving context. If the extremist, whether it's a Salafabist extremist or a religious extremist, feels that he can get away with it, he will, I mean, there's nothing stopping him from going out to sort of like incite people to engage in outgroup violence. But if he feels that, perhaps authorities are hovering around, he would probably adopt the soft mode of not violent speech, right? But the person remains an extremist, right? There are other examples, right? Just this year, there's this individual, Abdul Samad Batubara, was actually barred from entering Singapore in May 2022. And this guy is interesting. He was a very charismatic and popular Indonesian preacher with a huge social media presence. I mean, this is really huge. I mean, 6.5 million followers on Instagram, 2.7 million subscribers on YouTube, hundreds of thousands of followers on Facebook. And he has pull because he's a pretty good speaker in Bahasa, right? It's witty and humorous, not exactly theologically sophisticated, according to some scholars. And you see, the thing is, there's no real evidence that he supports groups like, for example, Islamic State. So technically, you can't really call him a Salafabist extremist, right? In the sense that, for example, Bashir, under him, JI was linked to Al Qaeda, right? But this person, Abdul Samad, he wasn't part of this sort of milieu, right? But based on his online postings, he was still arguably an extremist. For example, I mean, his both soft and hard modes were quite clearly seen. For example, he has referred to non-Muslims as kafirs or infidels. He called the Christian crucifix, dwelling for an infidel jinn, and declared infidels and the Chinese are seldom possessed because the fell demons are not allowed to tempt each other. That's pretty strong, although that's not really violent, but it's pretty strong. But he also engaged in violent rhetoric, so it's all the hard mode dangerous speech as well. He has claimed, and this is widely published, right, that suicide bombings and legitimate martyrdom operations, and that non-Muslims could conspire to oppress Muslims and slit their throats. Singapore was targeted. His followers called Singapore to be bombed and destroyed. And Facebook actually had to take down a post threatening to send Islamic defender troops to attack Singapore, like 911 in New York, right? Another comment warned that with just one missile, Singapore would be finished. This is because his followers were unhappy that the government in Singapore banned Abdul Samad from entering Singapore. But I mean, it's not clear to me which government will, like a Singaporean government will allow this sort of person, this sort of views to enter the country, But what's interesting was that Abdul Samad's online sermons actually helped radicalize a 17-year-old Singaporean who was influenced into believing that if he fought for Islamic State as a suicide bomber, he would die as a martyr. So although technically speaking, in terms of his beliefs, theological beliefs, can't really call Abdul Samad a Salafabist extremist, his views sort of indirectly promoted the Salafabist extremist mindset, right? So, he indirectly nurtured Salafabist extremism, right? And there's also this element of structural violence in his postings as well. He claimed that Singapore is Tanah Melayu, which is Malay land, that is part of the Indonesian Riau Islands, as well as Temasek, the Malay Kingdom. So the implication is that, non-Muslim Singaporeans are inherently second-class citizens with limited rights in the geopolitical context of a Malay Muslim majority archipelago, right? So the notion, and this is a rather extreme notion, right? Because it represents a clear deviation from the internationally recognized status of Singapore, multiracial, multi-religious Singapore as a sovereign, independent country, right? So what's the wider point here? There are Salafabist extremists online in Southeast Asia, but they are not the only types of fundamentalist extremists online. There are other types of fundamentalist extremists associated with Southeast Asian Islam as well, online in the online space in Southeast Asia. So we should not just over focus on those people who are directly linked to Al Qaeda and IS online. So we have to widen the analytical focus more, right? So the question which I then look at in the book is, how does the Salafabist ideology, which we've been talking about, how does it actually sustain and regenerate the threat groups in Southeast Asia, right? How does the ideology get disseminated? So, and this is where I talk about the role of ideological ecosystems that include, but are not just confined to social media. Social media is a big part of it, but it's not just social media. So I argue that the Salafabist ecosystem in Southeast Asia comprises 3 Ps: persons, platforms, and places. So persons are those individuals like, Bashir or Abdul Somad, who directly influence and help radicalize individuals. So they are they directly, are in contact with some of these people, impressionable young people, for example, and they get radicalized. So these persons, right? But there are also platforms such as print, audio, visual media, social media, carrying extremist content that radicalizing individuals can immerse themselves in, whether it's talking about your WhatsApp chats, or Telegram channel chats, or YouTube, and of course, it's interactive, right? The social media platforms. WhatsApp, you can send YouTube clips and all that sort of thing. And also, apart from persons and platforms, the third P is places, where individuals gather with extremists and get radicalized. And these do not have to be religious institutions. It can be private homes, it can be extremist religious institutions and gatherings. It can be sports clubs, training camps. So spaces where individuals can gather, listen to these persons and get immersed in these platforms and essentially create an echo chamber and get, radicalized. So the 3 Ps, persons, platforms, places, are quite important. Just to sort of illustrate, in the book, I talk about this guy, Abu Hamdi, whom I met several years ago, and he is now working with the authorities. Used to be a Abu Sayyaf group militant in the Philippines. And the 3 Ps certainly explain his radicalization. He was very much influenced by this person, Muhammad Jamal Khalifa, who was actually Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law, and who was the head of the IRO, which is an International Islamic Relief Organization, which was a Al-Qaeda-linked charity, who set up and funded a very relevant boarding school called Darul Imam Shafi in Marawi City in 1989 in Mindanao. So the person is Muhammad Jamal Khalifa. The place, right, Darul Imam Shafi, was very important. It was a very strategic boarding school for students between the ages of 18 and 21. So many of the graduates of Darul Imam Shafi later joined Abu Sayyaf and even the Moral Islamic Liberation Front, MILF, the bigger group, which is now sort of like became mainstream and works with the Philippine government closely, right? So notable Darul Imam Shafi alumni included senior Abu Sayyaf group leaders like Qaddafi Janjalini and Yasser Igasan. And the third P, platforms. Within the Darul Islam Shafi boarding school, Abu Hamdi mentioned and recalled that the young people there, they were immersed in publications by key figures which are favored by the Salafabist extremists. Ibn Taymiyyah is a classical Muslim scholar, but he had certain views which could be weaponized. For example, his view on jihad, right? Of course, jihad is a very broad, noble concept, but the Salafabist extremists just focus on the lesser jihad, which is always fighting, right? The violent interpretations. So other core Salafabist ideologues were also emphasized in this place, the Darul Imam Shafi, such as the publications by the Pakistani Maulana Maududi, Syed Qutb, right? It was Muslim Brotherhood, one of the key godfathers of, for example, Al-Qaeda, and of course, Al-Wahhab, who is the founder of Wahhabism, right? So, 3 Ps, persons, places, platforms, which are implicated in the radicalization of Abu Hamdi. Another example in the book is a Malaysian lecturer, Wan Min Wan Mat, whom I also met. Wan Min Wan Mat at one time was the treasurer for the Jamaah Islamiyah network in Southeast Asia. He is Malaysian. And the 3 Ps also applied to him. I mean, he was very much influenced by Bashir, and Bashir's co-founder of Jamaah Islamiyah, the late Abdullah Sungkar. So these two persons were very key radicalizing influences on Wan Min Wan Mat. In terms of places, just as Darul Imam Shafi'i was a key place for the radicalization of Abu Hamdi, this particular pesantren, which is a religious boarding school in Johor Bahru in Malaysia, Luqmanul Hakim Pesantren, was a key place where radicalization occurred. But also, apart from that religious boarding school, there was also private homes where the extremists met, and certain private spaces within a university in southern Malaysia. In terms of platforms, publications by Abdullah Azam, Ibn Tamiya, Muhammad Al-Wahhab, Syed Qutb, Faraj, right, who wrote the Neglected Duty, right, 1981, right, and all these other scholars, they were emphasized within this particular place, right? So this concept of al-wala wa al-bara is quite key to understanding Salafabism. It essentially refers to the idea of the principle of unity of association and disassociation. In other words, well, Muslims should just stick closely with other Muslims, co-believers, and disassociate from non-believers. Of course, I mean, all religions are like this, but of course, in Salafabist hands, this idea becomes up front and center and dominates everything else, right? So that's what extremism does, right? So what do we do about all this, right? So the book, final chapter, sort of like addresses the so what question. So how are we going to deal with all this Salafabist extremism? So I talk about the so-called 4M way, right? So the 4 M's, the first M is message content. And here I talk about how it's pretty important to promote what I call proactive alternative narratives to the Salafabist extremist narrative. And I say that, and I argue that, you know, it's actually better to have a proactive alternative narrative than reactive counter narrative. So what do I mean is, for example, you know, an example of a reactive counter narrative is when the Salafabist group says, you know, the government is against Islam. And then we react to that, we counter that with our narrative by saying, well, no, the government is for Islam, right? So rather than being reactive, we should come up with a more positive, proactive, alternative views. Like, for example, you know, tolerant Southeast Asian Islam is fully compatible with modernity, or Southeast Asian Islamic cultures are just as authentic as Arab Islamic culture. So something alternative, give them something to respond to for change, right? Message content aside, the way the message is framed is also important. So, and this is where I talk about the importance of sticky messaging, very influenced by Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, where he talks about sticky messaging, memorable messaging, the use of satire and humor, snackable content which can be digested relatively easily, message dissemination mechanisms, right? Careful precision in the use of platforms and audience targeting. For example, Twitter for government and media, and this is through my own research in the Southeast Asian context. You know, Twitter appeared to be better for reaching government media, and for youth, Instagram was better, right? But ultimately, the fourth M I wanted to emphasize was pretty important, because you can have wonderful message content, you can have excellent message framing, you can have a careful precision in your use of platforms to target different audiences, but ultimately, if you do not have message receptivity, the whole thing will go flat. Why? Because the audience will not even be in the mood to listen to you. So this ties in with the importance of good governance to address wider political, socio-economic grievances, thereby increasing target audience receptivity to your positive messaging. So for example, in Southeast Asia right now, one of the big challenges is the slow pace of Marawi reconstruction. So what happened was, right, between May and October 2017, there was a big battle in the Islamic city of Marawi in Mindanao, right, where there were 4 pro-ISIS threat groups that were trying to capture Marawi to sort of like establish a presence of ISIS in Southeast Asia, using Marawi and Mindanao as the base, right? So this was a so-called province, East Asia Vilayat, or East Asia province of ISIS. So it took about 5 months between May and October 2017 for that threat to be neutralized, but there was a lot of destruction of Marawi. So the pace of Marawi reconstruction is very important to deal with the problem of many displaced persons, including young people who were displaced, families that were displaced by the fighting. So if the reconstruction pace doesn't pick up, right, that could have create a vulnerable population that could be radicalized by the threat groups. So message receptivity is very, very important. So yeah, with that, that's all I had.
That's
Thanks.
great. Thank you so much, Professor Ramakrishna. That was a really interesting presentation, and I'm sure we're going to get lots of questions and comments from the audience. First, I'll kick it off. I'm really impressed with the analytical lens that you provide in the book for viewing extremism and identifying extremism, and also responding to extremism with counter narratives and alternative narratives. One of the things that I noted was that in your discussion of One Min, you applied the 7 characteristics of an extremist, the first of which is having views that are outside of the mainstream of that society. And you concluded that perhaps in the case of Malaysia, he wasn't that extreme because Malaysian views are moving in that direction. Could you comment just on the recent events of Anwar being elected Prime Minister? And you note in the book that he was one of the founding members of Angkatan Bela Islam Malaysia. How do you see that things going in terms of his politics? And also, can you apply that to Indonesia as well? Are we likely to see a kind of a continuation of that in Indonesian politics as well? That's a big covering a lot there, but if you could comment on that for a minute or so, and then we'll throw it over to the audience to ask questions.
Oh, those are excellent questions. Very, very topical. Yeah. What I would say for Malaysia, right? Anwar Ibrahim today is very, in my own view, right, is very different person from the Anwar Ibrahim of the early 1980s, right? He has gone through a fair bit in his political career, and the fact that his coalition, the Pakatan Harapan, is very much presents itself as a multiracial coalition, to me is a very important step in the right direction for Malaysia. So I don't see the concerns for my own view of Malaysian domestic politics becoming Salafabist from the Pakatan or Anwar direction. If you look at the results, what was to me potentially worth looking at from the point of view of analysis is the very good electoral performance of the Islamist party PAS, the Party Islam Indonesia. They did pretty well, right? That doesn't mean that we should all get very worried, because one of the things I tried to do in the book was to say that one shouldn't rush to label any institutional entity or person as an extremist. That's why I identified 7 characteristics, right? If the person or the institution displays 1 or 2 characteristics, I wouldn't want to suggest that, well, there's a big problem. But to me, it would be a big problem if the person or institution displays all 7 characteristics. Then I think there's something to worry about. So we look at PAS. PAS, they are different. They're not monolithic. You have those who are perhaps more hardline than others. So what is very important, I think, from the analytical point of view, is to observe PAS very closely, how they develop further going forward, and whether or not they are able to, the leaders emerge within PAS that demonstrate that they are willing to work with, non-Muslims in a substantial way, in a substantive way. So that's something to watch. In terms of Indonesia, the good thing about Indonesia, although some scholars have warned about, quote unquote, the challenge of Wahhabi colonialism, that's a term which has been used by some scholars, which essentially referring to the Salafabist challenge. Indonesia has certain strengths, and particularly we still see the great moderating influence of the big organizations, the traditionalist Nahdlatul Ulama, as well as the Javanized modernists, Muhammadiyah, which between them have millions of members and who are still very, very influential. Of course, the Salafabist challenge is also beginning to be seen even within the ranks of these organizations as well. So that is something which has to be watched. But thus far, I still see, at least for myself, enough evidence to at least feel that it, as long as the Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, who between them have such a significant religious displacement within Indonesia, I think there are sufficient cultural ballast against a bigger Salafabist penetration of the body politic.
Right. Okay. So a fairly optimistic outlook then.
Sure. I mean,
Great.
I think it's important to be optimistic.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question from Ulia.